I know it, you know it, everyone here knows that when it's time to pick your next class to main, it's all about what does the best DPS or who's doing the best healing, things like that, right? Well, if that's why you guys are here, I'm sorry to say that's not what I'm going to give you guys. Why? Well, because I don't want to lie to you. At this point in time, Blizzard is literally rolling out hotfixes every single day to balance or nerf the classes. What's good right now might actually be bad next week. The only time I will make a new tier list video is probably a few weeks after launch, and then even then, it's still probably going to be wrong by the time the raid comes out, because at that point, Blizzard loves to do last minute tuning right before or right after the raid. So because I don't want to be a snake oil salesman, I'm not going to be doing that. But what I will be doing is giving you some good questions to ask yourself so that making a choice of picking a main is going to be a lot easier. And honestly, I think doing it this way over just looking at what's the best DPS is actually a lot better for you in the long run. But before we get into that, I would just like to remind you guys to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you like my content. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. We are just a few days away from the pre-patch for Dragonflight, and like many of you, I'm asking myself, what am I going to be maining for this expansion? It's a good question, obviously. Some of you might pick a class and play it for a long time. Maybe you might play multiple alts, or even just have a main for one season and then change to something else. Either way, picking that class or spec is going to be the biggest decision you guys make in World of Warcraft. So I've created this video to help you nail down your decision, or at the very least help you narrow down your choices, so that way you guys have an easier time and feel more confident picking your main. Like I said before, balance tuning is an ongoing thing, and it's happening way too fast to ever be a consideration as to what you want to play. The only caveat to that is looking up trends from previous expansions or knowing which specs scale better than others. For example, Warlocks typically have always been in a good spot as far as DPS goes in raids for the longest time. Also, Fire Mages have always been a spec that scales incredibly well with the higher item level and typically at the end of an expansion as being one of the top DPS. But making your decision based solely on what's good is such a bad way of going about playing this game, and it will really lead to you burning out. Trust me, I have personally experienced this. There have been 2 times in recent memory where I have picked what was the best DPS, and I ended up quitting because I hated the playstyle of that spec. So please don't be like me, I am here to teach you from my failures. Pick what you enjoy playing. If there was a single takeaway from this video, it is this. You will have 100% better time in this game if you're playing something that you find fun. So what if you're not topping the meters? If you enjoy a spec and you want to do really good numbers, you will more than likely perform a lot better with that spec that you're enjoying. Now, this isn't part of the video, but here's a tip for playing a spec that isn't in the meta or flavor of the month. Don't compare yourself to the DPS in your raid. Just compare yourself to the other people who play your spec. It's a much better way to gauge your performance, comparing yourselves to people who play the spec and not your other raiders. So what if you're only rank 4 in the DPS for your raid group? If you're getting purple parses for that fight, does it even matter? But anyways, let's get back on topic before I get sidetracked. What are your goals? Do you plan to focus on raiding and possibly pushing to cutting edge? Or maybe you just want to run Mythic Plus? What about PvP? These are all great questions because establishing what kind of player you are will help narrow down some ideas or options for potential classes. Maybe you just only want to raid. If that's the case, it might be a good place to start by looking at specs that have unique raid utility or just some really big buffs that are super sought after, like a priest with power infusion, warlocks for their soul stones and portals, or even a demon hunter for their magic buff that they give to everyone. What about if you're someone who likes to do both Mythic Plus and also raiding? Well, if you're a DPS, then you might want to look for a class or spec that has a bit of utility, but also has a good damage profile for AoE, like a Fury Warrior or Outlaw Rogue. Again, we're not looking at what DPS is the best, though historically rogues have always been really good in Mythic Plus and pretty decent in raids. Deciding on tanking, DPSing, or healing is another huge choice in your decision. Are you someone who just wants to DPS? Well, picking a class that has 3 DPS specs is probably a good idea. Or maybe you just want to heal, but also DPS if you're needed, or just want to mix it up sometimes. Well, then maybe a priest or a shaman might be a good pick. But what about if you just want to cover all of your home bases? A paladin, druid, or monk can all DPS, tank, and heal depending on their spec. My point is to figure out which aspect of the MMO trinity you want to do, because once you get that decision nailed down, it's going to be really easy to help narrow down your choices. Like if you just set on tanking, well then you just narrow down your choices to 6 options. So deciding what role you want to do is going to make your decision pretty easy. Another really important question to ask yourself is that, are you a casual player or a more of a hardcore one? Do you only play a few hours a week and like to do pet battles? Or are you someone who does 30 hours a week and you're a cutting edge raider? Now this one's really big because if you're a casual player, the idea of the meta of what's good versus what's bad none of that really matters. Even if you like to do normal raids or do low keys with friends in Mythic Plus, literally every class and spec will perform fantastically in all of those situations. The meta or discussions of what's good and what's bad only really matters when you're starting to try to push and do really hard content. For example, for Mythic Plus, if you're someone who's trying to, do plus 20s or even higher than that, then yeah, the meta is gonna kind of matter if you're pugging things. And then the same thing can go for raiding if you're in a top 500 guild. And then at that point, you might need to have a few ults ready because you're gonna really need to keep your finger on the vein if you want to have a raid spot. Because the harder things you do in the game, the meta starts to matter a lot more. And that unfortunately is the biggest struggle of WoW and one of the issues I have with the game. I want to push and do harder content, but I know that it's gonna be a lot easier to do if I play a spec that does well. So I'm a DPS player, and while I want to do cutting edge in this first raid tier, I want to play something that's going to be needed for the raids, but also have 3 specs to choose from. So that's why I have 3 chances of a spec doing well, and for that situation, it's kind of why I'm starting to lean towards a mage. Now, if you're someone who has a group of friends or a guild that you regularly play with, then the meta and basically the specs for that meta really don't matter. If you enjoy playing a Feral Druid or some off-meta spec, your friends will still invite you and you'll still get invites to the raids. So in that kind of a situation, you really have the freedom to truly play literally whatever you want. However, if you're more of a solo player or you rely on pugging keys, then I would again maybe recommend getting a couple of ults ready so that way you can play them alongside your main character. And then let's say that the meta shows itself and we find out that, oh no, your character that you intended on being your main isn't very good. Well, you're going to have a couple of ults that are ready to go. So let's say, for the sake of arguments, that Rogues, Warlocks, and Shadow Priests all end up being really good picks for this new meta. Well, at that point, if you've decided to play an Enhanced Shaman, maybe it's time to swap over to that Havoc Demon Hunter that you've been keeping on the side. At the end of the day, if you enjoy playing that off-meta spec, then by all means do it. Just keep in mind that you will struggle to get invited to groups. This next question kind of feeds into the last one, but are you a solo player? Pugging will be more tricky on less desired specs, but for content other than that, like the world content, and you do like doing those kind of things, there are certain classes that do them very well. Like for example, playing a hunter. A BM hunter is fantastic for doing solo content out in the world, because they have a pet and that pet can pretty much tank for them. And the same can kind of go for warlocks too. But for more open world PvP kind of things, Rogues are always an awesome choice because of their stealth, which allows them to literally pick and choose their battles. Demon Hunters are also great in world PvP too, because if you're losing a fight, you can literally double jump and glide onto a roof of a building, or a very high rock that, the other person can't get to. So now that we've gone over some of the different questions, I hope it's given you guys some ideas to think about when considering what to play for Dragonflight. I know some of you were expecting a tier list, but again, it's just too early for that. I promise that once we have some solid numbers, I will be ranking all the specs, but for now, all we have to go for is what is fun and what utility a class might have. However, I will leave some suggestions for you guys that I think might be a couple of good options to look at. For tanks, Blood DK is always a solid pick, as well as Brewmaster Monk, and I think Prot Warrior is not going to be bad this time around. For melee DPS, Rogues, Havoc Demon Hunters, and Windwalker Monks are also really good. For range DPS, Warlocks, Mages, and Shadow Priests are all in a really solid place. And then for healers, I think Mistweaver Monk might actually be a really good option this time around, but if you're not feeling adventurous, then you can't go wrong with a Resto Shaman. So with that, I just want to thank you guys for staying in this video this long. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel because it really helps me out, and I will see you guys in the next video.